Welcome to the Mona Beginner Crash Course. In this tutorial we're looking at importing assets into Unity. We will first look at importing the assets, including textures, into Unity. After that we will create a material that includes those imported textures. And then we will finish setting up the asset with material and adding it to the scene. You can save your assets into the project directly from your external application such as Blender or Photoshop. The best place to save them is under your project folder under assets _ add your art here. Another common approach is to just drag and drop the assets from a file explorer into the project file as needed. This will copy the assets into the project rather than move them. The last example is to right-click on the folder in which you would like to store the asset and use Import New Asset. This will bring up a window in which you can select the assets you would like to import. You can import them all at once and then move them around, or simply import each asset in their desired folder. It is possible to export your 3D assets with materials and textures intact, but this usually requires plugins to make it easy. Therefore, it is recommended to import your textures and create the materials in Unity manually. Simply name your applied material in your external application as needed, and then import them. This gives you more control over the result with Unity. First, we need to make a material asset. We can do this by right-clicking on the folder you would like it in, such as the materials folder, and go to Create Material. It's a good practice to get into naming your assets as you create them to save time later. It is strongly recommended to use textures that are the power of 2, and preferably as a square. Examples include 64 by 64, right up to 2048 by 2048. If need be, you could also use a texture that it has a 2:1 or 1:2 ratio by a power of 2, such as 64 by 128 or 1024 by 2048. Due to the limitations of WebGL and space file size, 4K textures are not recommended apart from the skybox if need be. Once done, you can simply drag your textures into the box to the left of the respective category on the material. So your color texture, also known as albedo or diffuse, can go in the color box, metallic and smoothness in the metallic smoothness, normal in the normal, and so on. Note that if you add a normal map texture, it will come up with a warning. Make sure to set the texture itself to a normal map texture by either clicking on the fix now when you apply it in the material, or modifying the texture type on the texture itself. If you do not do this, your normal maps will look incorrect. It is possible to adjust the color of the diffuse texture, and as noted, you need to set the rendering mode to cutout, fade, or transparent in order for the alpha channel on the diffuse texture to work. Using the standard shader has the metallic on the red channel of the texture, and the smoothness is on the alpha channel. This is done to reduce the number of textures, as both metallic and smoothness only need grayscale images to work. You can create these textures manually in Photoshop, but it is easier to export these kinds of textures from applications such as Substance Painter using the Unity export tools. Emissive can also use a texture, but the amount it glows is still based on the intensity setting. The last thing we'll look at is setting up your asset with materials so that it is set up correctly every time you add it to the scene. This only works if you have applied a material to the asset in the external application. Select your asset in the project folder, then look in the inspector, and select Materials at the top. Drag and drop your material into the slot given, using the material names you set in your external application, and then hit Apply. It is of course possible to override default materials per object by using drag and drop with the texture from the project. In most cases, your imported assets may already have a material applied. If you add your model into the space, you will find that the material cannot be edited. This is another reason why I set up my own materials in Unity, so I have more control over the material. Moving on to the timelapse to import our room and armchair. So first up, create a new material. Then import the textures you want to apply to it. I use the Assets Materials and Assets Textures folders. Assign the textures to the material. As I'm not using any emissive yet, I don't add that texture. Only apply textures that you need, as each one adds to the file size. Once done, I apply the material to the model asset directly in the Materials tab. This way, every time I use the asset in the space, it will use my editable material. As you can see, the room seems to have a metallic appearance. So let's jump back into Blender to fix these up. First up, the room just needs to move its UVs to the right section, and the armchair and ottoman don't seem to line up in the viewport. The armchair and the ottoman just need to apply the transforms with Ctrl-A in Object Mode to reset the asset. Export both assets again, and you will see that they have been automatically updated in Unity. You may need to modify the assets if their transforms were incorrect, which is another reason I get into the habit of applying transforms before exporting assets. With the basics covered, let's speed up the process to about 10 speed and add more of our assets that were created in much the same way as the ones shown so far. Here I've imported all of the assets and applied all of the materials to them, so every time I import them into the space, they'll have the correct material. I needed to add a new material for glass. I usually keep glass material separate as it costs a little more in performance to have transparency. In this case, I modified the rendering mode from opaque to transparency, then adjusted the color and the alpha. Note how the material slots on the object reflect the material name you set in your 3D creation tool, in this case, Blender. Unfortunately, it takes a while. You don't seem to be able to select all of them and apply them all at once, so one by one is the way to go. Let's skip ahead to save some time. As I have so many assets to add, I decided to drag them all in at once into the hierarchy under the space parent object. How you add them to your scene is up to you. Just note that they do need to be under that parent space object, otherwise QA will give you a warning that you have more than one root object in the space scene. All these assets will be made available in the Mona library at the top, so if you want to jump into creating a space, you can do so quite easily. So the remainder of this time lapse is just placing the assets around in a way that suits the goals of the space. Keep in mind practical things like space for avatars to be able to walk through, as much as visual aesthetics. You may find that you need to modify or update some of your assets to make it work better. I can already see that the sofa and the armchairs are different yellow, for example. I also noticed that the windows don't really work with the layout that I want to use, so I can update that as well. And with that done, we can test the space in Mona. Note that my feet are a little below the floor. This is because the grey ground object that is below the floor has the collider. A collider is what the game engine considers solid, so that the avatar cannot fall or walk through it, such as floors, walls, and assets. The player camera also considers the colliders so that it stays within the boundaries of your space. So in this tutorial we went over importing assets from external applications, adding a material that uses textures rather than basic parameters, and setting up materials on imported assets to use by default. In the next tutorial, we will be looking at adding colliders to our assets so that our avatar walks on the correct floor and doesn't walk through any of our furniture. Thanks for watching, and happy building!